Today marks the one-year anniversary of my most extensive investigative report examining allegations of corruption in the Gordie Howe International Bridge project, which was brought to the attention of the public through the extensive research of industry expert Bob Ray.
Competent investigative agencies from the United States of America need to take a deeper look into this high-level corruption that was orchestrated from the Parliament in Canada.
There are people who are prepared to investigate.
In that report, I interviewed the leading expert on extradition law, Dr. Gary Botting. Given the rising tensions between the United States and Canada, the spillover of Uniparty's corruption into the US, and Donald Trump's growing frustration with Canada, I have decided to release the extended version of my interview with Dr. Botting.
Modern media, they don't dig in. They don't dig deeply at all.
Dr. Gary Botting is an international legal scholar, former investigative journalist, author, playwright, and a 30-year veteran criminal defense lawyer.
We have two guys barking at each other, exchanging insults and complaints. And where's governance in all of this?
He holds a PhD in law and a PhD in English literature, and he is the author of the leading textbook on extradition law. Over his career, he has provided legal expertise to high-profile clients and their legal teams, including Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou.
And that was enough for the United States to say, Madam Meng, we are going to charge you and put you under an indictment.
In this exclusive interview, we explore: can Canadian politicians be extradited to the United States? What legal remedies are available to U.S. companies harmed by corruption involving Canadian politicians? Does Canada have adequate anti-corruption laws, and are they effectively enforced? Is it possible to successfully fight an extradition request?
You can win that kind of dispute if you fight it, but first of all, the United States is prepared to take that forward, and they are prepared to extradite.
If you could please introduce yourself and your professional qualifications, please.
I have a PhD in English literature and a PhD in law. Basically, I've been a lawyer for 30 years, hard to believe, and before that, taught English and creative writing in universities and colleges in Alberta and BC. So that gives a nutshell. And before that, I was a journalist with South China Morning Post in Hong Kong and Peterborough Examiner in Ontario.
Can you please tell us about what you know about Bob Ray, and can you comment on his character and integrity?
Yes, Bob Ray is an amazing man. He has survived what most of us could never have gone through. I should point out I've been following his progress in Alberta, especially with respect to the neighboring Regina bypass operations in Saskatchewan, and also the Gordie Howe Bridge. And the biggest concern that he has had all the way through from India to here is corruption, and corruption in high places, both in India and in Canada, but especially here in Canada, because we don't think of ourselves as being third world, having third world values, being governed by corruption. I mean, all the aid that goes to all these various countries from Canada, from the United States, how much of it ends up in the pockets of corrupt politicians? I would say approximately 50%. So that people get 50%. It's rather like a game my sister used to play on us when we were kids. Too young to understand monetary value. She'd get a bunch of pennies, and there were three of us kids. My younger sister, would go, 1, 2, 3. We're going to play 1, 2, 3, okay? 1 for you, 2 for Gary, 3 for me. 1 for Liz, 2 for Gary, 3 for me. Well, when you think about it, that's democracy. But the three always comes to the people who are in control of the pile of money, and people like in the middle class, if you like, in the middle, like me. Okay, I got at least twice as much as my younger sister, and I got 1.5. I got okay, 2/3 of the amount that my bigger sister got, so I can't complain about that. So, and that's the way corruption works. In law school, you tend to think of the sandbox because all courts are basically glorified sandboxes. The kid in a sandbox throws sand at another kid and gets it in his eye. The kid screams. Parents come out and discipline the kid who did the throwing, ideally. And so they get into trouble and justice prevails. And basically everything that you can think of that appears in court has its origins in the sandbox, because that's where people learn how to treat each other, how to behave or not to behave, what works to your advantage and what doesn't. And it's the same here, except the sandbox here is Canada, and the people playing in the sand are ministers of various portfolios, and the people who stand to benefit from having huge projects again and again awarded to them by a government that is malleable and often blind in the wrong kinds of ways.
Very interesting. If I may ask you, do you have any favorite intellectuals?
Do I have favorite intellectuals?
Yeah.
I wouldn't call them necessarily intellectuals, but I admire Beverly McLaughlin, for example. She was the former Chief Justice of Canada. She's really quite amazing how consistently she made her judgments, consistently sound judgments that other people will rely on for centuries to come, or for decades for sure. Intellectuals, well, Robertson Davies, I suppose, who was my former boss when I worked for the Peterborough Examiner. Farley Mowat, hardly an intellectual. He would certainly squirm at that one, being called an intellectual. But he was a close friend when we were younger and went sailing together on Lake Ontario. People that I admire intellectually, well, you can't go wrong by saying Edward de Vere. Edward de Vere is the person who wrote almost all, in fact, if not all, of Shakespeare's works. Edward de Vere, I've been rereading Shakespeare from Edward de Vere's point of view, and it's so ridiculous to think that a country boy like Shakespeare was could have written all these amazing narratives, historical plays, tragedies that constantly quote Greek myths as if he's completely absorbed in it. It's become part of him, part of his culture. So the quintessential intellectual in English terms, at least in English literature terms, and probably in history, is Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, 17th Earl of Oxford, who is the real William Shakespeare.
Very interesting. If we may come back to our topic of corruption, I would like to ask you, that it seems that a Canadian federal cabinet minister named Amarjeet Sohi compromised and corrupted multiple projects in Canada with the Regina Bypass Project, and internationally, the Gordie Howe International Bridge Project. And if the allegations are true, then would he have to face the law in Canada, the United States, or both?
Wherever there's corruption, I mean, obviously that the country where it takes place has a say in whether or not they can press charges and whether there's enough evidence there to warrant that. The United States has pressed charges for corruption of by its own citizens, or for people who work with corporations that are incorporated in the United States. Now, for example, the Meng case, classic case of that, where in that case, it was a Hong Kong transaction in which Madame Meng represented that a subordinate company under Huawei was trading with Iran in contravention of the United States law. Well, what connection does this have with the United States? Just the fact that it was done in U.S. dollars, the transaction was done in U.S. dollars, even though the transaction was not completely fulfilled. But the fact that this is a UK bank, Shanghai, Hong Kong, or Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, a UK bank which has a clearinghouse in New York, and that was enough for the United States to say, Madam Meng, we are going to charge you and put you under an indictment, along with other people from Huawei, for misrepresenting the facts. And here we have a similar kind of situation where there is alleged misrepresentation and collusion among people who are in positions of authority and who can redirect government money to huge projects that straddle the border from the United States to Canada. So the United States certainly has standing to prosecute, and so does Canada.
Thank you for that response. That is very interesting. If I may ask, Sohi, Amarjeet Sohi, through his position of power, affected the economic interests of a privately owned company named Ambassador Bridge Company. Is there any legal remedies they could seek?
Well, civil remedies implies that there is somebody whose nose is out of joint for, in the seeking damages. So you'd have to prove that there is somebody, or obviously the individual or corporation that has been slighted can bring that kind of remedy. Not likely to happen, but criminal charges, well, it depends whether there's any element of fraud, corruption, bribery, whether there's any kind of complicity, conflict of interest, that type of thing. And that would trigger criminal proceedings, or at least criminal investigation. And so, yeah, both are possible, but it takes somebody with a very strong will to bring litigation of that kind, because it's so, it's like David and Goliath. I think it's important an investigation, a formal investigation, gets underway to ask, as it did with SNC Lavalin Company, to ask what the involvement was and whether this is ethical. And if it's not ethical, what is the remedy? Can it be that an individual is fined for it, or just wrapped on the knuckles, or what kind of remedy are we looking for, or is the person that's aggrieved looking for?
Mm-hmm. I see.
Now, in this case, the complainants would be people who stood to gain just basic contractual benefits from the construction of the bridges or the bypass in the case of Regina. And the fact that many, many small companies were sidelined and passed over and actually steamrolled by huge corporations that seem to be linked to the Sohis in various ways. And so that bears investigation. It certainly bears questioning. And that's where Bobby comes in, because Bobby Ray is meticulous in his research and has the complete oversight of, oversight in the sense of a broad vision, and is able to put everything into perspective.
If I may ask your opinion of anti-corruption, bribery, and bid rigging laws in Canada, do you think they are adequate and they are being enforced adequately in Canada?
Well, the criminal code is what it is, and if you read it, it goes on forever and seems to cover every eventuality, even when we don't ever apply it. And that's the biggest problem, is that it's not applied evenly. I'm sure that, it's rather like our neighbors to the south. Some people can get away with anything short of murder. And I'm sure some people do get away with murder. But the prosecutor looks the other way in certain states. But the law should be applied equally, and justice is blind in the sense that it doesn't discriminate. And in this case, it seems to discriminate against the rich, the powerful, the popular, in terms of political popularity anyway. So the mechanism is there. It's just a matter of who's willing to apply it. And what Crown Counsel or what prosecutor, what Attorney General is prepared to say, this deserves further examination. This deserves a commission of inquiry, or this deserves at least to go to the ethics commissioner, as long as the individual is still in government. And the government is slow to act on this kind of thing. And Bobby, for example, has been trying to get this before the courts and to bring attention to it for, I don't know, 10 years anyway. And he has dotted every I and crossed every T. Sometimes he's crossed his T's and dotted his, no, that's right. So basically he's done everything correctly. And yet there seems to be very little excitement over such a huge project going through. Sometimes the government is carried away with the end result, namely getting a bridge built or getting a bypass built in a timely fashion. And so it takes the course of least resistance and doesn't examine what the implications are for the economy generally. Especially this is true when you have huge megalithic corporations like SNC-Lavalin or Sohi's outfit coming in and taking over the reins, if you like, from all the small suppliers of gravel and construction materials that are required for such a big project.
I have only very few questions left. If I may ask you, generally, if a politician, a Canadian politician, a Canadian minister commits corruption or fraudulent activity that impacts the economic interests of the United States and its citizens, could the United States demand its extradition from Canada to US to try him in US?
Absolutely. That's been done. That's again, the Meng case is a classic case. She was just passing through Canada and they asked for her arrest. But I've had many cases, or I shouldn't say many, but several cases like that, where CEOs of corporations have called me saying, what am I going to do? You know, here am I at the airport and they're arresting me for this and that. And sometimes it's been completely unfair. Like one case, a chap from Belarus who had constructed the China, Turkestan, or Kazakhstan pipeline. And he was the one that had pulled everything together, made everything work. And it was funded by Rolls-Royce. It happens to have an office in the United States. And they charged all the executives of Rolls-Royce that were involved in bribery schemes. My client just simply did whatever he was told, and he wasn't American, he wasn't Canadian, he was simply somebody from a third country, granted, but in Kazakhstan, making this happen. And he made things work and put this whole package together. And of course, he was paid for it handsomely, but he decided to immigrate to Canada. And as soon as he touched down in Canada with his pregnant wife and his son to take up their house up on the hill here in Vancouver, they ordered his arrest on the same terms as Madame Meng. And why? Because he was alleged to have facilitated Rolls-Royce's bribery scheme. And the executives of Rolls-Royce walked because they were able to talk. They talked their way out of it because they could blame somebody else, namely my client, who happens to be just a patsy for them. And that's what happens. But the United States is all too willing to extradite somebody. Now, he was extradited to the States. He agreed to go down there. In fact, he went there voluntarily initially, and they didn't want to see him. But when he landed in Canada to immigrate, they arrested him and took him down to the United States. And they actually let him go for a year. When he came back, he was a week late getting back because of this and that, different officiating problems. And so he was given a year for skipping his first hearing, even though he was there within a week. Given a year in jail. So eventually you can win that kind of dispute if you fight it. But first of all, the United States is prepared to take that forward, and they are prepared to extradite if it impacts the American economy, American corporations, if the fraud, and it would have to be demonstrably fraud or corruption of that kind, if that could be halfway proved, and they believe that they have a prima facie case.
I have only 2 questions left. I don't want to keep you too much. One of the questions I would like to ask is about Bob's research. Do you think his research could be used to extradite or investigate the parties involved in the Gordie Howe International Bridge project?
I think it can be used for investigation, further investigation by officials, who are neutral in this. To find somebody who's neutral is going to be a challenge, because in this climate, especially in the States, there is no neutrality. There's polarization then, and it's horrific. Well, in Canada, it's not too different. We have 2 guys barking at each other, exchanging insults and complaints. And where's governance in all of this? What kind of model does it set up for the rest of the country? But anyway, that's there are people who are prepared to investigate reasonably, rationally, and look at it and take Bobby's description of what has happened and pursue that and ask questions and get the proof that is necessary. The evidence has to come in the form of documents that have been exchanged. And Bobby's alluded to a lot of this and has a lot of it. But the point is, somebody in authority, and it has to be a legal authority, has to examine it. And it could take it could lead to an inquiry by the Canadian government.
Well, this actually prompts a new question for me that I would like to ask you, since you're a former journalist. Since Bob has all this evidence, he told me that he has tried to get it publicized, but unfortunately, reporters, news outlets have refused to publish it, refused to give him the time of day. Do you have an opinion on the current climate of the media in Canada?
Yes, the climate of media. Well, when it comes to the United States media, it seems to be almost as polarized as politicians. So they either he has to find somebody who is sympathetic, who cares about corruption within their country. Same applies in Canada. I think you have, you tend to get journalists who want to write books before they write articles. But the old-fashioned journalism, investigative reporting, is confined to some very mainstream newspapers in the United States, like the Washington Post, New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and so on. They seem to be able to continue to express opinions and sell copies of their newspapers, but the trouble is the media, modern media, always skate over the surface. They don't dig in. They don't dig deeply at all. And you get programs like W5 that are exceptional to that, but basically they're trying to cover the whole waterfront, and they sometimes get lost in their own ambition, should we say, trying to cover so much area, so much ground that they don't, or they miss huge opportunities to express themselves in terms of investigative reporting. Having been an investigative reporter myself, it's a lost art, I think, largely. I mean, I write novels and legal texts, and that's challenging enough. But what needs to happen is, the writing of an expose to show exactly what has happened here in the case of the bridge and the bypass, and how corruption is alive and well in Canada.
I understand. If I may ask a final question, if a politician is involved in corrupt practices in Canadian soil with P3 projects that are taxpayer funded, if evidence emerges that raises concerns from one of the projects, should investigators look at every project that individual was involved in?
Well, it raises eyebrows, raises questions with respect to how, if they've tried to get away with something that's unethical in one project, why wouldn't they try to get away with it in another? And often it becomes habit forming. When often the problem becomes larger than the individual himself. So it's, it's like a snowball. You started rolling down the hill, and it's all very big fun, but all of a sudden it becomes an avalanche, and there's a car down below, and the avalanche hits the car, knocks it into a train, and the train goes off the tracks and rolls into a house, and where does it start and where does it end? But the point is, look at the kids throwing the snowballs, I guess, first, and work your way down until there's something significant where there's intention. There's intention to defraud. There's intention to act corruptly, to siphon off federal funds so the little guy, the little businessman, doesn't get the advantage of that, but only the huge megalithic corporations. And that's where this problem begins and ends, I think. The investigation into whether a megalithic corporation is with ties to, with corporate greed and ties to the cabinet of Canada, can is actually functioning in a way that is to the detriment of Canadians and ultimately to Americans as well.
Thank you very much for giving me an interview. If you don't have any last comments, we could wrap it up right now.
Well, you were saying about journalists and whether or not they're doing their job. And I would say that you're continuing the tradition of investigative reporting yourself. And I'm very impressed. I'm up there now in my 80s, and I joined the South China Morning Post when I was 18. And and became an investigative reporter shortly afterwards. And that's why my hair is gray. So I wish you all the best. But you're an example of where good journalism should be going.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that high endorsement. I will promise to live up to that and continue to excel in this profession, hopefully.
Good luck. Good luck with it.
If you would like to support me because I'm not government funded, please consider donating at mediabizergan.com/donate so I can do more work like this. Thank you.